Hi there everyone, thank you so much for coming tonight to listen to me give my talk. So I'm Lottie Namakando, I'm the Director of Behavioural Science and Innovation at Reflect Digital, and we're a performance marketing agency. And my team's role within the agency is to help brands better utilise their customer insights, their market intelligence and their customer journeys to supercharge their brand experiences, essentially. We're also part of the Human First Collective, which is a collection of agencies of which Reflect is one. Lab, which is our sister agency, which is a website development agency and digital product development agency, who again put humans at the heart of all of the work that they deliver. And we have a non-profit, Aspiration Digital, which is an initiative essentially to encourage young people into digital marketing as a career choice. So if you're interested in hearing more about any of those, but in particular Aspiration Digital, then follow us on LinkedIn, because we're always looking for people who want to help speak at these events to try and help encourage young people to think of digital marketing as a career. So my background, as I sort of alluded to, is behavioural research, innovation as well. So we look at ways for brands to utilise different data sources. Obviously AI is a big one of those areas as well. But the reason we combine behavioural science and AI together is because ultimately humans are at the centre of everything we do, regardless of whether we use AI or not. My background before that was I did research doctorate and then followed by about 13 years in paid media. So hence my topic today being predominantly around search, but hopefully it's going to give you a good idea of how you can use some sort of behavioural principles and market insights and intelligence for all of the different channels that I know everybody's working across. So hopefully it will be relevant, or you can see some of the opportunities to connect to your own work. If you want to chat with me afterwards about how that can connect, then just let me know. So, going to kick off with a little bit of a story. So, I'm sure that whilst not everyone here is from doing a search background, but you can probably all sympathise with this scenario, where you're kind of looking at delivering a piece of a campaign, a piece of content that's been produced, or an overall campaign delivery that you thought, that was going to work really, really well, and then it just didn't. The performance wasn't there. You're just not getting the traction. People aren't engaging with it, and you just don't know why. And I myself have been in those situations, and you have to take that moment back to sort of stop and think. Actually, you know what, it's not about you, it's about them, which is a quote from Clint Eastwood, which I think is a very pertinent quote, and I like to reference quite a lot, because what we are kind of guilty of when we're marketers is to think that we know everything, we know what the customer wants, we know what we need to do, but actually it's not about you, it's about them, it's about the customers, it's about what they want, it's about what they're seeing, and it's really difficult sometimes for us to take ourselves out of what we think and actually put ourselves in the shoes of our customers, even if we think we're doing that. So if you take a moment to think about how many brands have you seen or tried in the last year. So I've been a big fan of Audible and eBay as two examples, but in the last year or maybe a little bit longer than that, I've become an avid user of Vinted, which is a dangerous place to be, but nevertheless fantastic. But it gives me a completely different opportunity that I don't have to bid like I do on eBay, which you don't always have to do, but everything I seem to want is. And this is another opportunity to purchase, which previously wasn't available to me. And Blinkist is another brand that I've recently, that's last year or so, really engaged with. And I love Blinkist because again, it's given me content to listen to, which is different to what I'm going to get on Audible. If people aren't familiar, it basically gives you condensed blinks of a book that or a piece of work that you want to know about, but you don't necessarily have time to read a novel that's this big or whatever you want to go through. So again, it's giving me a different option to something that I didn't necessarily know that I needed and wasn't available to me before. All of a sudden, my attention is being split into another brand. Audible and eBay have done nothing wrong. It's just that actually what I needed and what I want has become different. So in those situations, you're not alone in knowing that actually, we're looking at different products all the time, we're deciding what we need, and actually what we need will change over time as well. And actually research shows that 71% of people will switch brands at least once in a year. Now, and that regardless of whether you think you're like a brand advocate, but if you suddenly need to change for a personal reason, then we're going to see those changes happen. 70% of people will switch brands for a higher quality alternative. So again, you might think that the product is great, we've got a loyal customer base, something else comes in, it's like, oh, that looks better, doesn't mean it is. All of a sudden people are going to think, oh, maybe I need to try that. They're going to switch for better deals, particularly when people financially, things are difficult, they're going to constantly be looking for different opportunities to save money. And 16% of people switch brands to fit their personal circumstances. So again, when those circumstances change for a plethora of reasons, that again can be a motivation to say, you know what, actually I'm going to switch a brand that I've maybe been engaging with for 20 years because I don't want to pay that subscription fee, or actually the service doesn't suit my needs now. And if you think about the fact that on average people have 5 brands in their consideration set, then your competition as a brand is high. And humans are both fickle and they're biased as well in decisions they're making. So you might think, I've got the best product, they've loved us, what's the problem? But people don't do that. They like brand loyalty is a whole thing. You know, people will do what suits them, won't necessarily be what suits them in a month's time. And essentially, all of those elements will then come into consideration when they're making those decisions, and they will influence those decision-making processes. And you've probably all seen the messy middle from Google, which really demonstrates the complexity of that purchase decision. It's no longer a case of, you know, years ago we thought, you know, people went through a very funnel focus. It's like, they're not. They're going in, they're going all round, they might go back, and then they're going down. It's a very complex process. And again, if you bear that in mind as a consumer, when you're a brand, you need to make sure that you're still within those spheres and are being relevant. And these factors can be anything that may not even be like you directly as a brand anything to do with you. You know, there'll be experience of you as a brand or a similar brand. This may still influence their decision. They'll have cognitive biases, which are those sort of predefined biases that they've already got in their head of like, actually I've had that experience before, I think it's going to be the similar thing, so I'm not going to go down that route. People make default decisions. I've always had that brand, so I'm just going to go down that route again, even though your product's better. People can't be bothered to make decisions because they've got too many decisions to make, so they're not going to go down that route. Or an emotion, which I think is a really interesting one, again, where people might make an emotional decision based on something they've experienced. It's got nothing to do with you as a brand. You've done nothing, but that's their experience, and that they associate you as a brand with something, and therefore that will affect their decision-making process. So when you think about it, like what factors are currently influencing the consumer's decisions? As we said, there are lots of them there. And therefore, can you be judged by the tactics that you're implementing in your search campaigns or any of your digital marketing campaigns alone? The answer is no, spoiler. Because actually you might be doing all the right things. You know, you've done the research at the time, you've put the proposal together, you've developed the product, you've put the marketing out there, you've created the piece of content, but it just hasn't hit home. But that could be nothing to do with you. That's because things have moved, things have changed in that time, and you just haven't necessarily kept up to date with that. So hopefully that's kind of a light bulb moment for you there. Okay, actually, you know what, we need to be thinking more than, you know, just in our own 4 walls. So you need to be keeping your finger on the pulse of your customers' needs and the competitor's strategy again, because that can be so easily overlooked. And that classic one where people, you know, I've heard so many times before, oh, you know, we're an e-commerce brand and, you know, Amazon's not our competition. Well, they're appearing in the search results with you, so you're competing with them, whether you like it or not. You may not be able to win against that in some instances, but the reality is, as a consumer, that is who they are being presented with. So you need to bear that in mind. And if suddenly Amazon starts bidding on terms that hadn't been bidding on before, it's going to affect your performance. You need to bear that in mind. You can't just say, okay, we're going to ignore that. So if we look at some examples, so most brands, if we're like honest about it, ultimately will do the same thing. They provide the same solution to a need. So if, you know, be it eBay Vintage, you want to buy something. If it's an audio, you know, you want to listen to something for a reason. They all ultimately do the same thing. So the experiential gifting brand. So this is a sector that I'd worked in for many years in one of the previous agencies I've worked at. Experiential gifting brands. So Red Letter Days, Virgin Experience Days, BI Gifts. So they sell, you know, experiences. So if you want to go for afternoon tea, or you want to go a driving experience, or et cetera, et cetera. But ultimately, the products they sell, they might have a few like, you know, limited ones, but most of them, they sell the same things. So if we then look at their landing pages, so this is Virgin Experience Days, so they've got up to 70% off savings. Buy a gift, they've got 80% off their savings. And then if you go to Red Letter Days, they've also got 80% off their summer savings. Now, a lot of these, they're very similar. You know, when you actually look at on the navigation, you've got birthdays, occasions, spa and beauty, drinks and dining. It's all the same thing. It's basically the same website, just with slightly different banners and slightly different colours. If you then take a step back to the search results, so obviously where you've searched on Google and then the listings that you get to answer the question that you've asked, so if you're looking for, I want an experience day, we have Red Letter Days here, and the language that they're using in their ad copy is credibility, availability and validity. So they talk about being official, they talk about next day delivery, and they talk about their vouchers being valid for 12 months. If you then look at Buy a Gift, They focus on validity to an extension, but they also use more emotive language in their copy. So give a loved one a unique and special present. You know, that doesn't appear, none of that fluffiness appears in the red letter days. They're just like, we're all here about the number of products we've got and the fact you can use a voucher for 12 months. Here, it's a slightly softer message that they're portraying in their ad copy. And then version experience days, they were looking at the range and discount. So again, they're talking specifically around driving days and experiences, and there's 75% off. So again, they're talking about the range of products that they've got, thousands of products, which we'll talk about in a minute, and unique and wonderful experiences. And all of a sudden, you've got huge differences in terms of what you're actually seeing in front of them. And they speak to the very different needs. So if you are an emotive person, actually that's really, it is a loved one I want to buy for. You're right, I need to buy from you. If it's, you know what, maybe I don't want to go through thousands of products, like maybe that's the appeal, or it's actually, you know what, I do want, because of 12-month validity, maybe that is something that's important now. That's actually going to be the main appeal for me. All of a sudden, you need to understand like which of those is the most important for the people that you're speaking to, and then think about what impact that message will have. Will it put people off? Actually, that's what they're looking to get that information up front. And then all of a sudden, despite the fact that the brands on the websites all offer the same product, what they're offering is different. It feels different to the consumer. And they've essentially used nudges to encourage the behaviours. And a nudge, in case you're not familiar, is a tweak to environment that can have a positive and big impact without limiting choice. So the idea behind nudges isn't that you are limiting somebody and forcing them down a route. It's about encouraging them in a way that makes a decision easier, but without limiting the choice that they have if they don't want to go down that route. So these are some examples of nudges that you can use that you probably are using, but you just don't necessarily know that's what they're called. But they're essentially these mental shortcuts and biases. So you look at cognitive biases and heuristics, which are terminology which relate to decisions that biases people make without thinking about it. And then there's mental shortcuts that you take that you don't know about that essentially makes you go from one point to another and be like, that's the decision I'm making. You may not even be aware of it. So here are 3 examples which relate particularly to the e-commerce space. We've got choice overload, so that point around thousands of products. If you give people too much choice, it's like, you know what, I don't, and who wants to surf through thousands of products? I don't. And so I've just done that, sorry. So that, whilst you think that's a really good, that's fantastic, actually that could put a lot of people off. I don't want thousands, I want 1, or I want 2. I don't want thousands. Scarcity effect, people assign higher value to items or opportunities that they perceive as being limited. So that's your, countdown timers. You've got a set amount of time before this sale is off. You can only have 10-minute offer before, you can't get this offer anymore. These are things that we're already using, but this is what it's doing. This is what it's speaking to, is that behavioural elements. And then present bias, the people will prioritise short-term rewards over long-term benefits. So actually that point around 12-month validity, does anyone care? If they're interested in the short-term, actually I'm more interested in the fact that I can get it this week because I need it now than I am about whether it can be valid for 12 months or not. So again, it's understanding, is that important to the consumer? Do we care about that? That's why you then decide what you need to put into your copy. So now you know the theory. Now you're going to see what you do next. So you observe, so you look at your competition and your customers, as I said at the beginning. What did they do in the past? Looking at that historical data will give you a huge amount of information about where are they going, what's their strategy, because ultimately that's what we're trying to work out. And I think we quite often overlook the past. So you can use different sort of sources to get sort of historical data, or you can start logging it, as I'll talk about in a moment. What are they doing now? Like, how is that strategy, or what have their tactics, how have they changed over time, and what might they be doing in the future? Can we try and predict that actually they've appeared to be going down this route? That's what's important to them. That's the messaging. That's when they go into sale. That's when they launch a new product. Can we sort of try and guess what they think they might be up to? And there's loads of different sources of data for competition, so your auction insights and search. You can look at ranking coverage. There's huge variety of different data sources. From a customer, you can do search and social trends. So you can look at what's happening on social media. You can look at Google Trends. You can use customer surveys, focus groups, customer journey maps. There's loads of data you can gather. And actually, not all of it you have to pay for. As I mentioned, there are some paid for platforms, but there's plenty in here that you can get that are free, that you can do yourself. So, as I sort of mentioned earlier, identifying who your search competition is super important. And again, like we've worked with brands where they just don't necessarily consider the actual competition that the customer is being faced with. They're like, well, our brand competition are these are our brand set, but that's not who's appearing against you're appearing against in the whole. And again, it's about understanding who is that competitor, because they're the ones you need to be monitoring, not necessarily ones who maybe aren't really in the same space as you. And you also need to decide the frequency of your data acquisition. So how often am I going to be gathering that data that I can then use? And this is something you can do manually. So I know obviously you can go, sometimes you go to these things like, oh, you have to spend all this money on this really expensive tool, but you can do this manually. You can just get a Google Drive doc or whatever you use to then create a list of the content of the competitors and their ads that are showing over time. So just go onto the search results page, take a screenshot. There we go. So what did it show, what did it say, and what did your content say at the same time, or your copy, or whatever it is to show at the same time? It can be as simple as that, and you can then track that back. And obviously these searches are personalised, there's loads of caveats, but this is going to be better than nothing, I can promise you. So definitely you can take this approach and have a go at doing that. And I'd really advocate the use of customer reviews on a quarterly basis. So again, a lot of brands will say, oh, we did our customer research a year ago or 2 years ago. That's fine, we know who our customer is. Well, you don't, because things have changed massively. If we look at what topics we're talking about now, what we were talking about 2 years ago, they're very different. And so you need to be keeping your finger on the pulse of what's happening to now, what's important to them now, in order to make sure that you are staying relevant. And then you can build that bank of insights and knowledge, essentially. So you kind of build that picture of what are you doing, what your competitor's doing. And then you can plan. And you can consider all of those different factors, like what discounts do they offer, what additional benefits do they offer, what kind of amounts, but not necessarily just what they offer, but when do they do it? When do they go about doing this? What is their sort of pricing strategy that they're using? And if you're in the sort of sphere of doing like content marketing or sort of digital PR, so you've got that structure of your content calendar in mind, so you can say like these are the areas we're going to focus on for January, February, March, etc. So you've got your content, you've got your promotions that you're going to put on there. What I then recommend you do is look at what your competitors are doing. So you can then overlay on the bottom half of the table here what their content is going to be. And it might be similar. It might actually be, they're going to talk about the same kinds of things. But you might find there are some differences. Okay, they've actually gone a slightly different angle to us, or they don't necessarily cover that particular topic for some reason. Why is that in itself would be interesting. And what are their promotions, and how does that match with your own? Because ultimately, if your promotion, you think, oh, 25% site-wide is amazing, and you've got 30% off selected, again, like the language there could influence the decision. So regardless of the fact that it's selected, you've got site-wide. If someone's 30%, that's what's going to attract me. Whether you've got 25% off, they're just going to disregard it. So your sale won't have the same impact as it might have done purely on the basis of the language that they've used versus your own. And as you can see then these differences, and that's going to ultimately impact what you're saying to your customers and what they're experiencing. And by doing that, you're going to have a better visibility on what is impacting the performance that we're seeing when actually we expected this to really go really well, because actually this for us 25% side-wide maybe is a really big discount. We've never offered that before. Doesn't matter. Do they care? Maybe they don't. If they don't know that, they're not interested. And then you test. So you have to remember that the variables you're testing are not your own. So you might be doing, oh, I'm testing this, but if a competition is testing something else, you just need to know what's going on. So don't always judge it on the basis of it's failed. Actually, what are the factors that are influencing that performance? And your tests are technically two-sided, as say it's your own copy or your own content against your competitors. But again, there's so many different factors in there. So try and make sure you're thinking about who is it that we're competing against in these situations, so you can understand, what you're up against, essentially. And then finally, as any good scientist, you evaluate your results. So you can then plot, this is an example, you can plot your research of your own performance data with your competitor, basically. So if you have your Google Analytics data, you could then have, this is click-through rate, for example, here, and you can say, actually, when we go into promotion, which is the pink line, we actually see an increase in click-through rate off the back of that particular performance. But actually, when we then overlay, we've seen that the competition's then gone into promotion 2 weeks later, or whatever it might be. You can then see, oh, actually, we're then seeing a massive drop in our click-through rate. Nothing to do with us, but that's purely on the basis of the fact that competition has done something which has then impacted the performance that we're seeing. And when you explore the impact that your message has on that engagement, you can then decide how you need to adapt your strategy to those, what's going on. And I think that could be one of the hardest things for brands to do, or any of us do when we're kind of devising these strategies, because strategies can be quite sort of, we've done the strategy, it's done, like that's our strategy. But if you just try and force something which actually isn't necessarily fit for purpose, not through anyone's fault, but because actually the need of the consumer has changed, you're not going to get, you're just going to be constantly disappointed with the performance. And by doing this, by keeping your eye on what's going on and being mindful of the fact that the strategy may need to change, will allow you to be more strategic and responsive. And I think that's one of the biggest problems, is where brands are like, I just can't be responsive. You know, if you're in the finance sector, there's often that feeling where you have to go through so much compliance that we're not able to be responsive. You can try and think about ways to get around that. Like, is there content and copy you can get signed off early, which is roughly along the lines of what you think you might need, that's available should that situation arise. And that way you can ensure your brand can respond to those market changes as they're needed, and which could be instigated by your competition or by your customers' needs. Because again, like, competition is going to be doing things, customers are going to be doing things. It's a busy world out there. So to recap, think about the world around your brand. So observe your competition and your customers. Plan based on the research that you've got, the insights. Don't go off a hunch. Go off what your data is telling you, because ultimately you might think that you're doing the right thing because you would do that. Unless you're your customer, which even if you are, you're a sample of one, you're not going to necessarily know what your customer actually needs. So base it on research. Consider all the variables when you're testing. Don't just chuck something out because, oh, it doesn't appear to work. Try and think about why is it that it maybe hasn't worked. Because sometimes you'll have an experiment, you're like, oh, the behavioural copy, it should work. It hasn't worked. Well, why is that? Is it because actually the copy was too personalised and it didn't feel right and it's a bit uncomfortable? There's going to be reasons. So consider all the variables and don't just, disregard something without really evaluating it. And then finally, evaluate with your competitors in mind. What is it that you've seen? What are your competitors doing? And ultimately, what are you trying to achieve? And as I mentioned, you can start big or as small as you want. So, I don't want people to think, oh, this is something that big budgets. It's not big budgets. You can do this small. Google Transparency Center. You can use Ahrefs if you've got access to that. Social listening, which you can use tools. You can just have a snoop yourself. You can do it on a monthly, weekly basis. I think during peak periods, you're probably going to do it daily, just to keep an eye on what's going on. Because you will see that brands, oh, well, they're going to launch on Friday. When is the next brand going to launch? So you just want to keep monitoring that to see what's going on. And then ultimately, the most important is create that repository, track those changes so you know what has happened, and then review that on a weekly basis and agree the actions off the back of it. So you don't have to constantly be trying to do it every day, because that's exhausting. But certainly have that data that you've gathered and then evaluate it and be like, okay, so the last week we thought this was going to happen, this has happened, what do we do about it? And adjust your strategy in accordance. And if you're not doing this, you really risk the opportunities that you're avoiding are huge. So if you think about some of the risks, so reduced credibility. If competitors understand how to speak more authentically to the customer because they've kept in tune with what they need and what's important, you're just going to lose. You're going to lose them. So the impact is quite high. The likelihood, they may not have as much of an impact, but on the whole, it's going to be an issue to be considered. Loss of market share. So if the competitors can adapt to the needs of the customers, and your product doesn't offer that same solution anymore, you're going to lose the impact of your brand, and the likelihood of that being a big issue is going to be huge. You'll be less relevant, because you're not staying in touch with customers. Customers know that. They're like, oh, you're not listening. That's really, you've really not thought about the customer when you've done that. And we can think of probably some examples recently where there's been backlash off the back, Audible being one of those, where they've not necessarily kept in touch with what customers want, and therefore they've made a poor decision potentially in terms of what their customers think. Stunted growth, like if you're not capitalising on the new because you don't know what customers want, that's where innovation is going to come in, where there's new ideas, looking at both your own peer set, but also looking at sectors that are maybe not directly related to your own, but ones that have similar challenges is a really interesting one. So recently we've talked with a brand where actually the challenges they had was around compliance, a lot of compliance issues. Actually finance is a very similar, doesn't have anything to do with their particular sector, but the challenges are very similar. It's like, okay, well look at finance. What does finance do that allows these things to happen, that maybe you're having blockers, and use that as a comparison rather than your peer set to say, you know what, we could do this. Finance does it. They've got really tight compliance. How do we get around that? And lack of innovation, because you're not challenging yourself, because you're just keeping your eyes down on what you're doing, you're not going to stay with the times. And again, there's going to be an issue there from a customer perspective and your opportunity to have that market share as a brand. So hopefully I've given you lots of thoughts and hopefully good places to start as well, because I want you to go away and think, how could I implement some of these areas in my particular marketing channels or the work that I do for my clients, or wherever you work for your brand. And ultimately, if you don't take anything away, take away with you. It's not about you, it's about them. It's about the customer, it's about what they need, and that as long as you keep that at the heart of everything you're thinking, then you should be able to sort of work your way through those challenging times. So thank you very much. I've no idea how long I've been talking for, but I think that was about right. There we go. Thank you. If I'm on LinkedIn, you can download the slides if you want to as well.
Has anyone got any questions for Lottie?
I have a question.
Yeah.
This is an odd question. I actually asked it before, but I was just curious about for search and people now using LLMs basically as their first form of search. I was just curious to know what your thought, by the way, there's no right answer to this, what your thoughts on how Google and other companies, but particularly Google, would look to monetize. For example, they've got Gemini now, which is their one. I know obviously traditionally they're pay-per-click, and that is what they use, but I'm just curious to get your thoughts and opinion of where you see that world going and what that kind of business model would look like for Google.
Yeah, so I think some people have said, the impact it might have on paid. I think I'm a very cynical person, and I can't see that Google is going to go in any way to reduce the revenue they can generate from their paid advertising. So it's definitely going to change the format. So at the moment, obviously, we haven't seen that change in terms of paid coming into those the AI-generated responses. But that's I think there's inevitable that will happen. The way that will be presented, it could be arguably that, with some of those, it'll be like sponsored again for legal reasons. It'll have to be defined that this is a sponsored link. But whether it's going to be the similar nature, but the targeting maybe is going to change on the back end. I mean, we're already seeing changes with Google in terms of using more less keyword based or more, it'll more like a Advantage Plus sort of formats with Meta. So the system essentially is using the information to make its own decisions as what it should target with who and what it should show. So I think we might start to see some more of those coming through as a result, but certainly the search terms, the terminology, we're having more conversational searches, so how will that play in? What kind of targeting would you do in order to have those conversations? I think what's also really interesting is the compression of the search process or the consideration process. So obviously we looked at the messy middle, which does elaborate the fact that that process can be very lengthy. But what we are seeing now is that some types of searches, you can start from like an initial query to an answer really fast, because actually the model is able to predict actually this is going to be what you want. Actually, that is what I want, more so than you're going to get through traditional search. So I think that's going to be really interesting, like how that's going to compress down, which is going to make those touch points when you are searching even more valuable, because there's going to be fewer of them as well. So I think it's interesting. I think we are seeing obviously people using more generative AI to search with. I mean, I do that as well, but we're not, when you actually look at the data in terms of the number of people using them versus traditional search is still way out there. Like it's nowhere near being overtaken by the likes of, and if you compare the rise of search from Google versus what you're seeing for generative AI, there isn't a comparison historically. Like search, it was massive. Generative AI is big. It's nowhere near as big as it was for search. So I think it's interesting. I think in marketing, we tend to be very sort of fixated on AI, like, it's a big thing, and it is a big thing, but obviously, when we look at the numbers, we have to sort of readjust ourselves to be like, okay, cool, it's good to keep an eye on that, see what's happening, but we don't necessarily need to panic right now, and obviously we just need to keep an eye on what's going on so that we can adapt our strategies in accordance. And I know at the moment brands are like, how can I get into the search results on generative AI platforms, which, there's some brands that recommend you can do that, and then others it's ideas about how you could do that. And at the moment there's no kind of definitive idea of how that approach takes. But it's going to be really interesting to see how that adapts. But in short, I don't think Google's going to be cutting off its revenue stream anytime soon.
Exactly, that's my question.
I mean, SEO on the other hand, I think there's challenges there with SEO. But I think again, like people talk about zero-click searches, but actually if you look at the number of zero-click searches proportion in like 2019 versus now, there's not a huge difference in terms of and zero-click search is a search where you're searching. It doesn't generate a website click, because either you go on to do another search or you get the information from the search results page directly, so you don't need to go into a site. So that's a zero-click search. And I think the panic was, all these searches, no one's going to go to a website again. It's like, well, they are still going to websites, and actually that proportion hasn't changed. But the role of a website and the role of content and how we're getting that content out there is going to change. Sorry, it's a very long answer to a question.
That's a great answer.
Sorry. That's all right.
Any other questions?
Yeah, so if it was B2B marketing with a long sales cycle, is there anything you would suggest doing maybe slightly differently or adapting at all within that advice?
No, so we work with a lot of B2B brands. I think in terms of the long lead cycle, because the nature of what we're looking at here is about kind of the search intent, because it's a search sphere, so they have to be obviously intent, actually physically searching. So you obviously want to look at that point in time. If your sales cycle is a 6-month sales cycle, let's say, you probably would want to then do an element of that research focus at that 6-month point, because there's a potential there that they might suddenly go, oh, you know, is this the right decision? Do I need to go somewhere else? So it depends on how locked in they are to the process and how long that sales cycle takes. But because I recommend doing this regularly anyway, you should be doing it. But definitely bear in mind what your sales cycle, if it's 12 months, whatever it might be. That again, it's why it's so important, because you in your head, you're like, we've got them, and they're in the door, we're having that conversation. But all it takes is that if you're not legally bound to that, and actually this product looks a bit more interesting, am I willing to take a step back in time in terms of having to restart the process? Depends on what the offering is. Maybe I am, in which case I'm out the door. And you've potentially, because you've not said, what, that brand is offering you this, we can also offer you that, or whatever it is. You might need to have those conversations with them as well. So I think B2B is a challenging one, also when you're looking at kind of getting quality data volumes and stuff for B2B, but there are definitely ways to adapt the processes to a B2B sphere, and you can apply the same principles to any sector, really.
Is there, I haven't properly formulated this, but I was just thinking, is there a bit of a discussion of are customer needs actually changing, or are disruptor brands making them think that their needs are changing? Or could it be a bit of a mixture of both?
It could be a bit of a mixture of both, because if it depends on how much assumption you're making that they've actually done some customer research. So some of those disruptor brands will, if they've done customer research, then they'll make the decision that actually this is a niche and opportunity, and this could be something that they think the customer needs that the customer may not realise they need. So when we're doing behavioural reviews, we'll look at using models like the COM-B model to understand whether people have the capability, opportunity and motivation to do something. In that process, you might identify that actually this is something that they really need, and therefore that could be something you then offer. So they do need it, they just didn't know they needed it. So it could be either they could be instigating the awareness of that need, or they could be fake, equally they could be telling people you need to do this and they don't necessarily need to. But as long as the value is there, then people will be like, yeah, actually this is worthwhile. It's as long as you're getting something from it, ultimately that's what they need. But it's a good question.
Okay, well, there's no more questions. And thank you so much, Lottie.
Thank you. Thanks so much for listening. Thank you.